That's what really got me interested in the history. And somebody had recently published a book that listed every state in the union. They had gotten the tax records or whatever, and they had it listed by cities, by state, and then by cities. And so I went to the Pennsylvania section of this book, and I'm looking at these towns. Well, this town had 6 breweries. And so I sat there with a road map, and I circled every town that was in this book.
Yeah.
And I said to my friend, well, we should go to every one of these towns and see if there's anything to photograph.
Yeah.
So that's where the history got started.
Got it.
Me. It was to document every standing brewery building in Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Welcome back to the Brew That Podcast. I'm your host, Richie Tevlin, joined as always with Evan Blum. And today we welcome on beer historian, author, Rich Wagner. Welcome. So you wrote the book, Philadelphia Beer. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It was an incredible read. But I think a lot of the people that we've had on, people have mentioned this. And I really, really enjoyed the book. We were talking about this just right now before we started recording, the people that we have on now kind of have a different perspective of, what we consider the beer industry in Philadelphia. Kind of what the history was, how it got to the point where craft beer started, and then all just the stories of you kind of see the history of Philadelphia, kind of told in the story of beer in Philadelphia. So I thought it was a really, really cool book, and I'm just excited to get you on here and kind of hear it from the man himself.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yep. So I guess most people we say, let's start from the beginning. Most people start in 2008, I started working at, Sly Fox or, Iron Hill. But I guess, do you want to start with kind of your story, or do you want to start from the beginning of kind of beer?
1981, I was reading the newspaper and it said, interested in home brewing? Send away for a free copy of Zymergy magazine. So
is that actually real?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Started homebrewing in 83. Quickly figured out, I need a big kettle if I want to do full all mash brewing. And then it was, right from there. But
cool.
I really have to credit Charlie Papazian and the Zymergy, because remember, this is before the internet. This is like the Paleozoic era, dinosaurs roamed the earth,
I've dropped the joke a couple times whenever people bring up homebrewing. I say the joy of homebrewing, and I think it goes right over their head. And I think that book came out after when you started doing it.
Well, we went to the first GABF in 82.
Wow. And that was in Denver?
In Denver.
Okay.
And we got the VIP tour at Coors. Charlie Papazian rented a double-decker British-style bus.
Wow.
We went to Coors, and we had they had a malt. We saw the malting process. We saw the pilot brewery. We saw the room where they did their tasting and they explained about the flavor wheel and everything. And that was 82. So, I got to meet a lot of people there I hadn't started home brewing yet. And
they were at the top of the game.
And I have a story about visiting that on my website, but the list of breweries that had beer there, it was basically Sierra Nevada and this guy, now I can't think of it, Sacramento something, but it was there was only 2 or 3 what you would call craft breweries.
But was Coors there pouring beer?
Well, they were doing a test market on Killian's Red Ale, and Michael Jackson was there with his recorder. And I remember he asked my wife what she thought about the Killian's, and she says, tastes like Coors with red dye number 2. And he deleted that from the phone. But no, it was Yuengling was one of the few breweries that was still making beer, ale, and porter.
Yeah.
FX Matt still had an ale, or I think it was at Matt. But there, on this, my story, I have the list because I still have the documents from visiting. And so that's what I mean. Like, this is the beginnings of it, you know?
Yeah, ground zero.
Yeah.
So I guess this was, you said, before you started homebrewing?
Yeah, I started homebrewing in 1983.
So you went there and you kind of came back and
I talked to people. I said, well, I was thinking about brewing outside. Do you think that's okay? And, you know, people hemmed and hawed. But I got to meet Fred Eckert and Charlie Papazian.
Yeah.
And Bert Grant was there. Like, all the heavy hitters were there. It was, you know, it was really the beginning of something happening. You could tell something was happening.
Yeah. You didn't know what it was, but it was like there's excitement.
You know, when Carter legalized home brewing in 76 or 78, whatever year that was, it didn't take long for this to start. And, you know, Papazian was a master. I mean, he went to school for nuclear engineering.
Yeah.
You know, so he was a pretty smart cookie, and look at what he accomplished, what he did to the industry.
Yeah. I mean, just like, you know, his book is just like, you know, how to build, you know, a mash tun, you know, with PVC pipes and a cooler. And
well, okay. Now then there's another guy, Buffalo Bill Owens.
Yeah.
He had the first brew pub in California.
Yeah.
And he published a book, How to Build a Microbrewery for $250. Which I purchased, and then my friend and me built one in his basement, and we were doing that. And
like, to the T, like for $250.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you got an old keg, and you made that your brew kettle, and you got an old hot water heater stand, and put the kettle in there, and had a flame underneath, and had a reverse flow. You know, cooler system in the ceiling that we did with siphoning, but I had seen it in action, because in addition to going to Coors in 1982, after the big tasting and everything, the next day we went out to the original Boulder Brewery that was in Longmont, Colorado, on the goat farm. And they had like a garden hose, you know, wrapped around, you know, hanging up there. That was their
professional brewing equipment,
reverse flow cooling system, because it had, you know, the copper and everything. But
that's pretty crazy. So at this point, were there any brewers in Philadelphia? I mean, when did Dock Street come around? That was
okay.
There's Stouts, I guess. Stouts was the first one?
87, Schmidt's closed.
Okay.
That was the first time in over 300 years that the city had no breweries.
Wow.
And so the way I like to tell the story is, it's like when you cut down a big tree, the roots are still active.
Yeah.
And then these new trees start to come up.
Yeah.
It only took like a year and a half or less.
To fill that back in.
And then David Mink had the Sansom Street Oyster House.
Yeah.
And he got the upstairs rooms, and then he built the Samuel Adams brew house. Mm-hmm. And it was loosely connected with Jim Cook. You know, they didn't really have financial ties, but he got the permission to use that name, and it benefited both of them. And then that was 89. That was November of 89. And then I think it might have been the fall of 91. That's when the first Dock Street opened at 18th and Cherry. Now, the difference was Samuel Adams was in a really small space, so they were using extract.
That's the first and only time I ever heard a professional brewery using extract, which is crazy.
Well, I had been around the block, so I had seen a lot of that, and there was a lot of snobbery about that. But I also thought, this guy has been in the restaurant business for 3 generations, and he's doing this.
Yeah.
Because all of us homebrewers had been sitting around, when are we going to get a brew pub? Well, I'm going to open the first brew pub. Who's this guy? You know. Anyway, but then 91, that's when Dock Street opened, and they were the first full mash brewery.
Okay.
And then their mission statement was to take Michael Jackson's book, Beers of the World or whatever it's called, and make everyone in that book.
Just start exploring.
I think they did that. And when you go back and look at the old Mid-Atlantic Brewing Newses and the reporting of the day, they were doing stuff with flowers. They were, you think people are being innovative now. They were doing a lot of that same stuff. You getting wine casks from Chad's Ford Winery, and laying the beer in there. And
I think in many ways the brewing industry has gotten less innovative. I think that the beers that brewers are putting out have less crazy ingredients now. There's less crazy things kind of happening.
Well, I mean, that was Dogfish Head. I mean, really kind of elevated that to, hey, see if you can top this. We're going to get this tree from Brazil and make a tank out of it, and, or whatever they.
So it was, I guess, 7 years between you starting your home brew and these first breweries opening up. What was the home brewing scene like then? Was it just you and a couple of people? Was there a community of people doing it?
Well, for me, the guy, Charlie Brem, had his shop was called U-Brew.
Okay.
He was a take on U-Haul.
Yeah.
And it was right across from the Roslyn train station.
Okay.
So I got to know him, and then through hanging around at his shop, then I got to know other people, and then that's when there was a bunch of those movers and shakers that formed Home Brewers of Philadelphia in the suburbs. And so, and that really, for me, elevated it. In other words, how am I going to do this full mash brewing and talking to people who, even though like there were some old timers back then that had been brewing with extract for years.
Yeah.
There's one guy that Budweiser sold like a brick, like it looked like you'd buy butter in, except it was like a 1 pound package of their yeast.
Oh, really? They were selling.
They would sell to bagel factories,
my God.
bagel bakeries, and he would get that. And we were fermenting with that. I fermented with a lot of different things, and my first thing was I want to make the lightest beer I can. Because when you make a light beer, it has to be perfect.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so that's how I got started.
I mean, what styles were you making back then? Were people even making IPAs, or was it just like kind of English style ales?
Well,
and
the big thing was hops.
Okay, yeah.
And so and of course, along with that, then going to beer distributors, and in Pennsylvania, you had to buy a whole case.
Yeah. So
you didn't get a chance to, if you wanted to try the Watney's Red Barrel.
Yeah, if you like it.
You had to buy a case, So, but we were doing that, and then Charlie said, "Oh, there's a liquor store over in Jersey and Mount Laurel. We'd go there, and you could put together a whole case of 24 different bottles."
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, and actually, one of the bottles I bought was from New Albion, which was the very first microbrewery after Anchor.
Yeah.
But this was a guy that started in a garage, not on a big scale or whatever. And so they had been out of business for 3 years when I bought this bottle.
Oh, my God.
I still have it in my collection.
That's
it's still
crazy.
Full.
Yeah.
But that also, like, I have this interest in history too, so that was like present day history.
Yeah, yeah.
Practically yesterday.
Yeah. So you were homebrewing, but you've now written a book, and you just said you're a historian. Like, what was your career before that, or like what was your kind of day job as you were brewing? Like,
well, I started out. I spent 23 years in the classroom. I was a science teacher in high school.
Okay.
But in 1980, a friend of mine from college, we and our girlfriends hopped into a 1950 Buick, and we traveled around the state of Pennsylvania for our summer vacation.
Yeah.
And we went to see about 6 different breweries.
Out of what, 8?
I think there were 9. We didn't go to the one in Fogelsville. We didn't go to Schmidt's, and we didn't go to Ortlieb's. But we went to the Jones Brewing Company in Smithton, the Stonies.
Yeah.
We went to the Latrobe Brewing Company, makers of Rolling Rock.
Yeah.
We went to Yuengling, of course. We went to the Lion.
Was it?
We went to Straub. The first one was Straub up in St. Mary's. So that's what really got me on the trail.
Yeah.
And so after we went, and in between towns, we'd stop and have lunch or talk to some locals in a bar, and they, every town around here had a brewery, and then they would tell us we're the one that was still standing, and we'd see these hulking wrecks of, holes punched into the walls to take the tanks out when they went out of business. And that's what, all these breweries we visited, they were all sitting around going, who's next? Who's next?
Yeah.
Who's going to close next? Mm-hmm. Because it was the
consolidation.
Bud and Miller and television advertising had basically cornered the market.
And all these breweries, they were all making light lagers. I mean, Yuengling has the amber lager. What types of beers were they making?
They were making standard American lager beers at that time.
Yeah.
So, but that's what really got me interested in the history. And somebody had recently published a book that listed every state in the union. They had gotten the tax records or whatever, and they had it listed by cities, by state, and then by cities. And so I went to the Pennsylvania section of this book, and I'm looking at these towns. Well, this town had 6 breweries. And so I sat there with a road map, and I circled every town that was in this book.
Yeah.
And I said to my friend, well, we should go to every one of these towns and see if there's anything to photograph.
Yeah.
So that's where the history got started.
Got it.
It was to document every standing brewery building in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And so we found roughly 200. We went to roughly 400 locations.
So about 200 were knocked down or just unrecognizable.
There's nothing. And some of these towns we'd go to, well, here's a wall that was part of it, okay, I'll taking a picture of that, And so, but that's really where the history started. And then it went from talking to accosting old guys on the street to ask them where the brewery was, to actually having a book, and then going to libraries, going to historical societies, and looking for. And then I got connected with the collecting community.
What's the collecting community?
The Breweriana collectors. Beer trays from the 19th century.
Oh, wow.
Had these beautiful factory scenes, and I'm going, oh wow. We were there, except it's a vacant lot now, or wow, this is the only picture we're going to ever see of this.
The brewery trays are cool because everybody had them, and it does. It's they all have the picture of the brewery on, and that makes it look like this magnificent factory.
Yeah, yeah. And so from there, I got to know some of these old time brewmasters.
Okay.
And the one guy was Bill Muller.
Yeah.
He was like a 4th generation brewmaster. His dad and his uncles had made beer during Prohibition.
Is that now the distributors now? Is that the same family?
No, Muller.
Muller.
Moell.
Okay.
But his dad and his uncles brewed beer for the beer baron from Reading, Max Hassel. And this guy had a network of breweries throughout eastern Pennsylvania and northern New Jersey. He had like 28 or 30 breweries during Prohibition. And Bill's dad, Bill grew up listening to his uncles and stuff talk about this stuff, and so, my friend Rich Doctor and I ended up at Bill Muller's house, and he started talking to us, and, I took some of my home brew up, and, he tasted it and gave me a pat on the back, But then he said, I actually wrote a story for when the master brewers met in Philadelphia in 1966. I did a 4-part, leading up to the convention. I wrote 4 articles on the history of brewing in southeastern Pennsylvania for the members, before they came to the conference. I said, oh, Bill, I don't know. I don't have that. That would be down at the United States Brewers Association in Washington, D.C. So, like, I got on the phone, and then a week later, Rich Doctor and I are down at the boardroom of the United States Brewers Association, and there's bound volumes of the Western Brewer, the trade journal, and other trade journals.
Yeah.
And the Western Brewer, the first issue was 1876.
Wow.
And so it went to, like, the Prohibition era.
Wow.
And I looked at this, and we.
And what's in those books? It's just like breweries and how much volume they're making. It was just tax documents, or
it was a trade journal. It had tons of ads, beautifully illustrated. Like before the days of photography, there's this great line drawings and everything.
Yeah.
But also technical information and news of the industry. Who's building what, and what are they doing?
New technology, refrigeration,
new technology, and everything else.
Refrigeration.
So I looked at this, and we started looking at some of these and taking some notes. And I said, we could go through all of these and find everything to do with Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And Rich Doctor looked at me. He goes, "We're not doing that." And I thought to myself at the time, I says, maybe we're not going to do it, but I know I'm going to be doing that. And so over the next 15 years, I would go down to Washington, D.C. 1 or 2 days a week.
Oh, my gosh.
A year, and go through. I started at 1876, page by page, and either Xeroxed or transcribed everything I could find from Pennsylvania.
Wow.
So that was over a 15-year period. And
is that the basis of the book, or the most information is coming from there?
No.
You're just like a archaeologist at this point, like looking for information.
But then 30 years later, whatever, the American Breweriana Association, the people who have collecting, they have the National Brewery Museum in Potosi, Wisconsin. They wanted to put these all on, they wanted to scan these volumes and have them available on their website to members. So I got involved in driving down to Washington, D.C. to pick up half a dozen of these books at a time, bring them back up to Philadelphia, and then drive them up to Brooklyn to have the guy scan them, and then bring them back down to Washington and get 6 more. And I did that. And so now there is this collection of the Western Brewer online for members of the American Breweriana Association.
Wow.
So, okay, that's one thing. And I really thought I had a lot of information, but now with newspapers.com and I get down into these rabbit holes. It's like one pit of quicksand after the other.
Yeah, you keep finding out.
But before the internet, there was the Free Library of Philadelphia. And so they had the microfilm room. So there's these other trade journals, there were newspapers that were specific to Pennsylvania liquor industry. And so one was called Tap and Tavern, and the other one was called The Observer. And so I went through them looking for everything about Philadelphia breweries or anything to do with Pennsylvania. And I don't know if any of you have been to a microfilm experience. The room is not dark, and you're looking at a projection through film, and you're trying to squint and see this stuff. Anyway,
it's a lot of work.
Yeah, and then I found all these other things. Then that cross the hall, then they have the map room. There's these.
So they have like the diagrams of the buildings,
volumes of maps of city, and then in Philadelphia, at least, we have a very. I don't know who else has this kind of collection, but the Hexamer General Surveys were insurance surveys of industries. And so those are now available online. But at the time, I was going and looking at them.
And what happens? Like those things, they get old enough that then the insurance documents become available?
No,
by insurance
they were always available. But in other words, insurers wanted to know what the risk was.
Okay.
So if they have a chemical dye works or a brewery or a distillery, like they would say, well, is there any fires? Is there
okay?
And so, but the kind of information that is contained in those is so detailed. Like how thick the walls are, what they're made out of, if there's a watchman on duty, are there any employees living on the premises, all this stuff. And so, like, again, going there in the 80s, I started doing this
pre-internet
in the 85, 86.
Yeah.
They were still using like thermofax type copy paper that was like this chemical thing. I have a stack of maps in my drawer. You can still smell this chemical paper thing. And now they're scanned in color. You can enlarge them, shrink them down, look at them anytime you want at 2 o'clock in the morning. You don't have to wait till the library opens. It's incredible. So that and the library, and then, of course, the Urban Archives. Temple Urban Archives has a folder specific to these.
My roommate is getting his PhD at Temple. He's studying like sociology, like human sexuality, but through the lens of breweries and or essentially bar life in Philadelphia from like the sexual revolution on. But he's looking at the map rooms. He's looking at the historical documents here. It's kind of the same story, but not specific to breweries.
Could take any path, you know. I'm a seeker.
Yes, yes.
So then getting to know some of these guys that worked at Schmidt's, they encouraged me to come to Master Brewers meetings. Then I started to hear the technical talks. Really got me, you know, wow. As I was a science teacher, so and science and technology, and sure, this is really perfectly dovetailed, you know, because because I know a little about these various disciplines and everything, but then brewing like touches everything, you know, from microbiology to physics to, you know, everything in between. So
you put all that together and then created this?
Do you think there's anything you missed, like, at some point? Like, I feel like you hit every just avenue you could to, like, find information.
Well, like I said, I started doing – we had gone around a lot of smaller towns from 1980 to 85. And then after having seen a lot of stuff and done a Pittsburgh, which is another pretty big city, that's when I really got serious about Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is such a big story because it goes back to colonial times and everything. So, yeah, I mean, and so starting in 85, I published that in 2012. So it took me that long to compile stuff. I started writing articles about it. I started doing PowerPoints. I was doing PowerPoints based on my research at Yards and then at Philly Brewing. We would have a Saturday afternoon, you know, I'd have a slideshow. Like the one I'm just writing about is Joe Ortlieb. I did one called Ortlieb's Brewers by Birth.
That's 2 blocks from here.
And which was an expression, a slogan that they had, and so the whole family came to see my presentation.
What did they approve of it?
No, I mean, you know, there was even one story in there about this Joe's Uncle Joe, who he's named for.
Yeah,
he was one of the sons of Trooper that ran the brewery until he was 89 years old, died in 1969. But Uncle Joe, I got a box of family memorabilia after Henry died, and I'm looking through this, and there's a letter. It's written in German, and there's a photograph of Trooper, a portrait of Trooper, and I got this person to translate the letter for me, and it says, this is a portrait of Trooper, it's in a bank in his hometown. And so the kids would come from schools to visit the bank, you know, for a field trip, and they would say, and this is Trooper Ortlieb. He saved his money in our bank and then went to America and became a successful brewer and businessman. And you should, you know, you can do it too, or whatever, you know. And Joe goes, I never knew that story. and it was in his box of stuff.
Yeah.
But no one had ever translated it.
Wow.
So, and then that started off. After that, I got to know Joe. I got to, I took him to Trooper's farmhouse outside of Lansdale. He had never been there, like he was beside himself.
So who were the first lager brewers in the country? Was that the Ortlieb Brewery?
Well, across the street from the Ortlieb Brewery, there's a Pennsylvania historic marker that I had put up, and it's for John Wagner.
Are you related to him?
No.
Okay. All right. There's a conversation we've had before on the podcast that we don't know.
If you look in the phone book, then I know they don't have phone books anymore, but there's more Smiths. There's more Wagners than Smiths.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a story that's like shrouded in mystery and argumented. There's people in St. Louis that claim that Lemp brewed the first lager beer in America, and I'm going, St. Louis is at the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi River. Like Philadelphia is
You don't think it happened here first?
right on the thing, and it's been a brewing center since, and one of Ortlieb's ads was, we were brewing beer in Philadelphia when St. Louis was little more than an Indian reservation. So, and to their credit, like for the Indians, that area, that confluence was the equivalent of New York City, the Vatican, and Washington, D.C. It was like the big center of, their First Nation people or whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, there was a lot of caves in St. Louis from all the glaciers and stuff, like at Card Caves. So it made sense that could be
In St. Louis?
that it could be become a lager beer center. But my money is on Philadelphia.
I mean, it's way more probable that they would at least stop by here first and try it here.
Well, if you were worried about the yeast, you're bringing yeast.
Yeah, it's not like they had planes back then.
You don't want to have to take the boat up the river after you get here. John Wagner got here, went to his sister's at her husband's house, and started brewing. He didn't have to go to St. Louis.
Yeah.
So, and like I said, that's an argument that'll never be. There'll be no end to that.
I guess there's no true evidence, so we can just have some beers, keep arguing about it.
It's funny because one of the among the collecting community, there's a guy who has a website devoted to people who collect beer and soda bottles. It's called North American Sodas and Beers, and he has done an incredible amount of research. Same kind of stuff I do, but not just with brewing. So he came up with some actual newspaper clippings that, in my mind, helped to verify the story of John Wagner, even though, like, in the newspaper, his name was spelled differently. But that's really common. I've read enough of these old newspapers to know that if you got an Irishman taking down names of a German, he's going to spell them the way they do in English or the other way around. So, and most recently there was this guy from Britain, and there's some clubs over there that are really into recreating old beer recipes and everything. But he took me to task, and he said, he made it sound like we were a bunch of fools having this big marker dedication ceremony. And I'm going, I put his article on my website. I said, okay, fine. Mm-hmm. But that's what I mean. Like, there's always going to be somebody that says what I said isn't true. We have it in St. Louis. We have it here. Have it there. Somebody said they were doing it in Virginia. There was an article about the first lager in Virginia. Part of it is the fact that lager means a couple different things.
Yeah, lager yeast, lagerine. It's like
yes, that's part of the thing too. Anyway, I got the mark.
You got
the mark. Philadelphia
official.
Has the mark.
Yes, it's official. Cool. I mean, so a lot of the stuff that you're, I guess, reading about started in 1800s, late 1800s, but your book starts, in the revolutionary times, even before we were a country. So where did you find that information?
Well, I mean, when I started home brewing, I started growing hops. And then I found out that Pennsbury Manor, up in Morrisville, and I said, they had an herb garden. And I went there and so they had me set up a trellis and we had some hops growing. And then this guy, Tom Pastorius, he's the great-great-grandson of the original Pastorius that came from Germany and settled Germantown. He's the first German boatload of Germans was invited here by Penn in like 1685. And so Tom Pastorius he's the descendant of that guy. He started the first brew pub in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, in 1989, I believe.
What was that called? Do you remember?
That was the Allegheny Brewery and Restaurant.
Okay.
It was in the old Eberhardt and Ober Brewery, which is another aspect which I love, is when you reincarnate a brewery, it becomes a brewery again. Mm-hmm. But anyway, he wanted to call the company Pennsylvania Brewing Company. So it was a loose thing. He donated money so that the Pennsbury Manor Foundation or the people could develop a brewing program. And so I had planted hops in their herb garden, and they said, well, would you like to try to interpret the brewing process?
Oh, like way back when?
1989.
So, like, they wanted you to just figure out how to brew beer, not like historically.
They had equipment made. Pastorius financed this. They had this guy from New Hampshire who had a cooper shop make these tubs and barrels. And when they said to me, would you like to interpret the brewing process? I'm not sure how long a New York minute is, but you get the idea. Oh, yeah. Oh, I don't think I want to do that. Are you kidding me? So I brewed, we first we had to make sure that the smokestack worked and all that. And so I dried some of the hops that we had grown. Then I made a batch with syrup. And then in 1990, we did our first full mash brew.
And was it barley malt back then? Like, were they making beer with barley?
Yes. And Pastorius he milled it for us.
Oh my gosh!
And I used the hops that I had grown in their garden, and that was 1990. And as far as I know, that's the first time anybody has interpreted that colonial process. So,
what did it taste like?
I thought it was good.
Did it taste like modern beer? Or did it have like a different kind of?
It was like
what style would be most close? Like a mild or something?
I just use that's another thing when I do. We'll get to that later, but I don't get complicated with recipes. Basically I use pale malt, hops and yeast, and see what I get.
Yeah.
But the Pennsbury, that had been inspired by this guy Bill Muller that sent me down to the United States Brewers Association, that told me that I read his articles about the early, you asked about the early times. He read his articles about the early taverns and everything in southeastern Pennsylvania. So, and then, of course, there was a section on Penn. So that was kind of inspired by him.
Okay.
And then in the process of the learning curve of what to do and how to go about this, that's when I tapped into a lot of these old timers that worked for Schmitz or worked elsewhere. And I had come across two other old time retired brewmasters, to help me, pick their brain and I'm asking them stuff that had nothing to do with their careers, we're talking about 1680 something. But to answer your question, there are other collections that go back to that period.
Okay.
Like the American Philosophical Society, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania.
But I imagine the primary source information for that is much different. It's probably letters and stuff as opposed to recorded data.
There are ledgers of breweries. We sold this much beer to this tavern and this tavern,
Okay.
ship captain, this thing. But then there's also a couple of brewing logs in there, brewmaster's notes
Yeah.
from like 3 or 4 different breweries that I've seen. And so when I was writing this and I was trying to talk about that old time period, I tried to look at some of their notes. And I actually sat down, I went to Yards, and I sat down with Franklin Winslow, and I said, okay, here's their notes. Like, if we're going to set this up and brew tomorrow, what do we do?
Yeah.
And I had worked at Independence Brewing Company. I had worked at Manioc Brewing. But still, it was nice to have somebody that was
Actively brewing.
To bounce the ideas off of, and it's still, that's the thing. This process goes back to the ancient Egyptians. You boil water and you do this and you do that. It's just how you accomplish those.
Yeah. I heard in a previous interview that you did that a lot of these things, it just said add hops. It wasn't like styles of hops or add grain. And like there weren't necessarily styles of beer. It was kind of just like,
well,
make what you can make, and this is the general way that you do it.
The way I describe it in the book is when they would brew beer, you had a hot liquor tank. If you were a wealthy person, maybe you had a cold liquor tank to go with it. You had to hand pump things or have horses turning the wheel to make things pump and so forth.
You still use hard now.
Yeah. You still had to use gravity whenever possible.
Yeah.
But they would run first runnings in the mash.
Yeah.
They collect that, and then they have this shallow pan.
Yep. The cool shit.
Well, they take it from the mash, they boil it.
Yeah.
After the boil, then it goes to this cool ship. Well, then they get the second runnings. But before they do that, they might add 20% new grain.
Yeah.
To get what,
this enzyme.
That's second runnings. So the first runnings are strong beer. The second runnings are middling beer. So then there's a second cool ship for the second runnings. And then the third runnings, it's treacle. I mean, it's and they might add molasses to it. They might add table beer.
Yeah, table beer.
And it would be like 2 or 3% of that, And so it was all priced accordingly because it's all based on
how drunk you're getting.
Well, no, your malt bill, how much it costs to make it. So the first runnings is going to be the 6% beer. The second runnings is the 4%, and the third runnings is the.
What were people saying in any of these notes? Like, because cool ships, when I think of them as like sour beers, cool ships. Were these beers kind of sour?
Well, there's a difference between how the monks used the cool ship in Belgium, where they're relying on ambient yeast and using a cool ship
just to cool down,
just to cool the beer down, and then get it into the starting tub and then pitching yeast in there.
Okay.
So but that was how you cooled it.
Yeah.
So, and that's another aspect, that they got involved with is seeing these technological advancements. Mm-hmm. So the first thing they did when they did the cool ship, first thing they did to speed it up was put a fan in the room. And then when plumbing became possible, then they would pipe it with cold water pipes in the cool ship to speed it up even more.
With some lead pipes.
or whatever. But you know what I mean? Like up until a certain time, there was no plumbing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I go to this Genesee Village up in Mumford, New York, and they have an 1803 reconstruction of an 1803 brew house.
Really?
And they brew there.
No way.
And so I got pictures of it, but they have these three big primary tons. It's like a 5-barrel batch.
And are they kind of wooden tubs?
Big wooden tubs, 4 feet tall. But then they go down to the casks, That, it's tertiary.
Yeah.
But the hose is like if you took a leather belt and flipped it around into a cylinder and then put rivets in it. That's the hose. I thought that, like that's taking it back. That's getting pretty serious about, because And the other thing was, it was the first time when I watched, I went there 2 years in a row because it's a 2-day process, and I only got to see it one day, the 1 year. But they had troughs. So to transfer hot liquor to the mash, there's a wooden trough. And so there's no hoses, So that's another. And actually, I found out later when I went up to this thing, they had used some of my interpretation of the century brewing methods to interpret their.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I was proud of that.
Do you have a cool ship at, where is it, Pennsbury Mansion?
We did not.
Okay.
We just let it cool.
Okay.
After, in 1993, I said, I don't want to be tied down to Pennsbury Manor.
Yeah.
So I went around looking to see if I could make my own brewing system. And I'm teaching at school, and this guy comes up to me. He says, "Here, my kid's school newspaper has this Cooper on the front. He's got a little wooden bucket, and he's got his colonial hat on and everything." And I go, "Wow!" So I got in touch with that guy, and he's now at that point he was a retired industrial arts teacher, and when I told him what I wanted to do, he was on board. And so for the next 6 months, I would go up to his shop every Wednesday after dinner, and we'd work. And we started with 2 cypress logs, and we split them into staves, and we made a mash tun and a receiving tub, and we made a baler. And then my friend got me a copper kettle from an antique shop up in central Pennsylvania, and we made a stand for it from some old wrought iron things that I had laying around. And so then in 1993, I tested it out. I brewed several batches at home, and we were using 5-gallon cornies, And so I filled up 6 cornies. I made a couple batches. I had 6 cornies. And we went to the Oregon Brewers Festival in 1993. And I drove it out. I drove my system out. And they were also having the 150th anniversary of the Oregon Trail. So I had a trailer on the back of my van, my wife and my son, and we drove out there and we went to the Oregon Brewers Festival, and we had our fire going, and it was over a 3-day period. It was 60,000 people.
Oh, wow.
And we were near the gate, so when the people were in line waiting to get in, they could smell the steam and
everyone walks over. What are you doing?
The malt, everything, And then we actually did that at 3 different locations along the Oregon Trail on our way back home. So that was the maiden voyage. That was the beginnings of me taking the system that I had made with this teacher on the road. We went all the way to Oregon to do it, So I like to say that I've done my colonial brewing from coast to coast.
Have you found other people doing this colonial brewing across the country? Like, are there people in St. Louis or Virginia or, kind of other people?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because I'd like to say I have a little bit of credit for the number of people who are doing that, because I have all this stuff on my website.
Yeah.
And people have told me, "Oh, I found your, the one article I did basically laid it all out, I said, it's not rocket science. You boil some water. It's just whether you have something made out of stainless steel or something you have made out of wood.
Yeah.
But I could think of 6 or 8 people that I've heard of, and some of them have come and seen me, do my presentation. So I think that's really cool, because I'd like to. I don't know of anybody else that had tried to do this prior to 1990. What's interesting about Pennsbury Manor was that was all a reconstruction of Pennsbury, the mansion and the brew and bake. They have a bake and brew house there. And so that was built during the Depression from the Works Projects Administration. And so when they opened that, like in the 30s, the master brewers from Philadelphia had their meeting on a Friday night, and then on a Saturday they drove up to Pennsbury. And they had an article about them all looking at the stuff and weighing in on the accuracy or how they would have done it, or, you know, this or that or the other thing. And so one of the old-time brewmasters that I got to know, he didn't go to that, but he had just, you know, become part of the master brewers at the time, and he remembered them talking about that meeting and everything. And he really gave me a lot of credit. He says, you know, it's incredible. Like that was like 1939 or something. He goes, it's incredible that you're actually brewing beer there.
Yeah, I mean, that's 60 years later on
Who'd have thunk it? Yeah. So
kind of putting it, I guess, like you brewing it gives you a kind of different perspective also. Like you're seeing all these different primary source information, all this stuff, but like when you're actually going out there and brewing it the same way they are, like you kind of see it from their perspective.
I have an overactive imagination.
Yeah.
So when I read these things, I try to put myself in their shoes, as it were. You know, like how do I do that? Like, how did I do that at Pennsbury? Well, they had, you know, these kettles recessed into a firebox, and, you know, okay, now what do I do?
Yeah.
You heat the water, and then you put it in the mash tun.
Yeah.
You know?
How many different systems like have you like pretty much cultivated over the years?
Just the one that I made, and the one I used at Pennsbury.
Okay.
But there's another place in Dayton, Ohio. Drawing a blank on the name, but they have a colonial, not a colonial. They have a 1840 version of a brewing system, and they do similar thing where I think they actually have a modern system behind the scenes. But they can go through the process and show people the same thing, but it's all arranged on gravity, you know, and everything. So it's and so there's two. Like I went to the one in Mumford, New York, to see the cool ship, because I heard they had a cool ship. Basically, that's why I went there. The one in Dayton, I just happened to hear about and say, "Gee, that was my dream at one time, was to have a brew pub that was done all, you know,
with gravity,
the old way, authentic, you know, with stuff."
Have you seen stuff in your studies of, like, you know, starting 1680? I mean, that's 90 years before the country was founded. You know, it's like, what were the kind of beer styles? Was it only English style ales? I mean, I can't even think, like, what are German ales like? I mean, were there Belgian ales? Like, what were the styles of beer back then that people were brewing?
Well,
or were they even styles, or was it just like beer?
As I said, you know, and again, like any question in history, it's like, well, what year, what place, and what circumstance.
Yeah.
So when I go back to reading the Pennsylvania Gazette from the 1700s, say before the Revolutionary War, all I'm seeing is strong, middle, and small beer.
Okay.
And I might see some things about pale ale.
But besides that, there's like no distinction as far as style, or were a lot of them using things like pine and, you know, spruce, or were they using other things besides hops regularly, or were they using molasses in beer?
You have to remember, Philadelphia was the largest English-speaking city outside of London.
Okay.
These people had relatives.
Yeah.
We weren't like the Pilgrims freezing our tails off, waiting for the Indians to give us some turkey dinner, you know?
Yeah.
It's, you know, like you look at Philadelphia, had an emerging artisanal class, crafts people, furniture industry, you know, like all kinds of things were going on.
Yeah.
I mean, even when we were a colony, especially when we were a colony, like from 1685, people were perfectly fine with being subjects of the crown for 100 years because
they felt like they were
grew the economy, it grew the industry, grew everything because they ruled the sea. They, you know, we had commerce, we had trade, you know, like all this stuff. So I see pale ale talked about. but I don't really see the thing about like all this styles. And
When does that emerge?
well, I
though?
think what I was going to say is I think they may have been talking about styles more in Europe
Okay.
and maybe in England,
Okay.
and maybe just what I'm reading in the newspaper from 400 years ago
Yeah.
is the way it was reported here.
Okay.
Actually, there was I did an article on Philadelphia Weiss beer brewers, which is the Berliner Weiss.
Yeah.
And there's the earliest article I saw was from like the, really old time. Another one I saw was there was a tavern that was going to have Welsh ale.
What's Welsh ale?
The style of ale that they brewed in Wales, I guess. So.
So,
But and then you also asked about the pine and the this and
yeah.
that I wanted to get away from that because these people, these professional brewers, they were using malt and
They were actually were.
yeah. They weren't like hard scrabble.
Yeah.
Gee, we can't get any hops. We'll use these pine
Yeah.
bombs.
Yeah.
Although that's a style of beer in Scandinavia and so forth. And so
Yeah.
on. But I think to your point, yeah, it was mostly English.
Okay.
English style. I mean, that's where the people came from.
Okay. And then when did, I guess, the next big change in beer was the emergence of lager? And did that come with the Germans kind of coming into the city? Was that around the same time?
Well, I mean, lager, this is a whole big issue. We were just talking earlier about you got the word lager that means to store.
Yeah.
Then you've got lager beer yeast.
Yeah.
And you've got these monks that were the natural philosophers, is what they called them, the scientists of the day.
Yeah.
Gregor Mendel and his peas and so forth. So these are the guys, and it was all very secretive. But that's where I think the lager beer yeast came from.
Okay.
And I know they've done a whole history of the genealogy of it and everything. I never read the whole thing. It's technical, but the one time I was at a master brewers meeting and I asked the guy from Y Yeast or one of those companies, and he said, well, to him, like his simple answer was, it's a lager beer yeast is like a cross between the ale yeast and a champagne yeast. So that's how you got. But I think by doing things in the cold, you
condition them.
They condition them to be.
As yeast change so quickly.
I think that's where lager, like, it really goes way back. Like 1840 might have been when John Wagner brought some of that yeast here. But it was right around that time, I think 1842, that the Pilsner style was introduced and so forth. So this was stuff that was happening, and again, it was.
And were most of the hops that they were using, was that hops that they were growing here? Were they bringing those hops in from England?
They would.
Just whatever they had?
Well, it was commerce.
Okay.
So, like, you would grow them here.
Yeah.
But then, particularly later on, like a lot of the German brewers making those styles of beer would be advertising the fact that they
had German hops.
Czechoslovakian or German hops. But back then, I forget that this is about malt, but they said at a certain point, importing malt from England had virtually ceased. In other words, they could grow enough barley.
Here. They didn't need it.
They didn't need it. So hops, I guess, if they needed them, but and that's another thing that makes brewing goes back to the beginning of civilization. Is the fact that it's an agricultural product. So you're at the mercy of the elements. If you have a bad year for one or your other ingredients, then that's when you have to start. Oh, do we want some pine bombs in this?
I still want to get drunk, but
there's an old article about this after World War I. The English were doing home brewing or something. They couldn't get beer, but they were getting yeast from the bark of a tree. like they peel the bark off
Yeah.
and get the yeast out of, and they called it bee beer, I think, because when it started to ferment, it looked like bees flying around.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know.
Richie, when we went to Brooklyn, we went to Six Point, what was that they gave us? Do you remember? It wasn't technically beer, but
Grew it?
yes.
It grew its beer
Yeah.
without hops, right? It has like just spices in it. Grew, yeah.
I always mean to memorize this expression, but Martin Luther, Reformation, something, and hops all came to England the same year. It's a quote that I never quite memorized. But before they had hops, and as the story goes, the guys coming back from the Crusades came through Czechoslovakia and places like that where they were using hops. And so then they brought that knowledge to England. And England being an island nation and kind of like, well, we know how to do things. They don't know anything over there on the mainland, whatever. It took a while, but and plus I think the church had a thing where,
Those different blends that they
were selling the spices that you could use in making beer.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it was all, codified or something.
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, that's the Gruit was what they called their beer before they started adding hops.
Wild. Yeah.
And hops originally, from the Czech standpoint, originally it was to increase the shelf life, but then also became part of the flavor profile.
So at what point was it really the Industrial Revolution and lager brewing that the large brewing factories started to pop up? Or when did you start to see brewing shift from more like a home activity to, there was established, these are actual brewery businesses around the city?
Well, you have to go back to England for that.
Okay.
I mean, that's when the alewife.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
when it was just part of the domestic thing.
Yeah.
And then when I don't know exactly at what point, but at some point, you needed capital, you needed a big building, and you started to do it on a larger scale. And so, when I look at, I have a timeline that I have a lot of different things in for this early period, but I'll see how many breweries there were in London.
Yeah.
When there was a dozen in Philadelphia, but it did take off, and that was part of this industrial revolution.
So you saw it happen in London first? And
in England and
Yeah.
Europe, where you had this long-standing tradition of brewing and so forth. And with the technological advances, and I think mostly a lot had to do with the steam power.
Okay.
But in Philadelphia, yes, there were housewives that were brewing beer. But by the time things were happening here, it was pretty much there was an industrial version of that.
Yeah.
By the time 1685 or whatever here.
Okay. And I guess when that all started to happen, the main brewing areas were, I guess, around here and around Germantown. Were there concentrations of breweries, or they were all spread out and every neighborhood had their own?
Well, if you go back, Dock Creek.
Where's that?
Dock Street.
Okay. Was that a creek?
Dock
before?
Street?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was a creek.
Okay.
And so where the mouth of that creek was the Blue Anchor Tavern.
Okay.
And when Penn came to lay out the city, that's where he disembarked from the Welcome and went and had a pint of ale at the Blue Anchor Tavern. But within 10 years, there were a half a dozen breweries along Dock Creek.
Huh.
And so the city really developed from the river to about 3rd Street.
Okay.
That was the city. And it was, from Vine to South and from the river to 3rd.
That's crazy. It's so small.
Well, where Independence Hall was that 6th Street?
Yeah.
5th or 6th? And where City Hall is today, there were wolves baying. That was the woods.
Yeah.
So, Yeah. No. So depending on the time period, in the 16s and the early 17s and so forth, I actually made a map of all the breweries that I could find, and there's like a wedge, like what I just described from the river front street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street, and it was like, I think, 60 or 70 different breweries up until like 1800.
Yeah.
And these would have been like the little brew pub, the little small, 7-barrel system or whatever. The first one, William Frampton on Dock Street, he was the first brewer in Philadelphia, 1683, I think. He had a 15-barrel kettle.
That's larger than most of the breweries here in the city right now.
I think this 715, whatever, is a long-standing thing.
Yeah.
It goes way back into time. It just was the natural sizing, I guess.
Yeah. That's funny. Like, things don't ever change.
It's crazy to just see the cycle of how many breweries there were to how many then there weren't. And then just now again to see that.
Okay. And in Philadelphia, you asked earlier about the rise of the lager and industrial and so forth. Say the centennial celebration was in 1876. Two things were very significant for the brewing industry. One was that was the same year that Louis Pasteur had identified yeast as what it was. Up until that time, they had argued about whether it was animal, mineral, or vegetable. As it turned out, fungus is sort of animal and vegetable. It doesn't have any chlorophyll and blah, 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 blah. But anyway, that and artificial refrigeration, which propelled the lager beer industry.
Yeah.
And so those two things, 1876. So from then on, like by 1890, let's say, 1888, there were just shy of 100 breweries in Philadelphia. And then they started to go smaller and smaller and smaller. The number goes down because of the large
Consolidation.
Well, not consolidation so much as that there was so much more profitability with larger
economic
things.
size, yeah.
Yeah. And so a lot of things went along with that, like transportation, engineering, being able to make buildings, like having different kind of structural, the Phoenix column.
I mean, the 3-tier system didn't exist back then. Like the breweries were the ones transporting the beer. I mean, were they the ones owning the bars as well?
There was a lot of that. That was a carryover from the tied houses in England.
Yeah.
It wasn't, I don't think it was quite as
I mean, in England, that's all they had. It was like, there was 3 different, I guess, bar owners. There's just the breweries, but
when Prohibition came, Bergner and Engel was the biggest brewery in the city. I think they had like $300,000 worth of bar properties.
okay.
So whatever $300,000 is in 1920 money,
Yeah.
it's probably $1 million,
Yeah.
a couple $1 million today. They probably had 30 or 40
Little houses, pie houses.
And so what you would do is that they were basically if you were the tavern owner, you paid an extra $5 for their keg of beer, and then that's how they were paying the mortgage for you. So you were indebted to them.
Got it.
And a lot of times that precluded you from selling other brands. But again, I don't think it was as tightly controlled or set up quite the same way it was in England. In England, yeah.
Okay.
But that was, and then they passed laws to try to eliminate that, but a lot of things were grandfathered in.
Yeah.
So, but it was like having these outlets. It was like today's tap rooms.
Yeah.
Except they would have a dozen of them.
Yeah.
2.
Yeah. That's funny. It's like things are, coming back.
You always talk about the cycle.
Yeah. Like in craft beer, it's just like we're reinventing like craft beer is hospitality, but like, that's what it was 150 years ago.
1920 to 1933 was Prohibition. It took this long to undo what they tried to undo, or tried to tie up, and in other words, the governor of Pennsylvania was a dry, and so when after Prohibition he said, we want to make it as difficult as possible to obtain alcohol in this Keystone State.
Yeah, fuck that guy.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, look at what's happened. Like when Dock Street opened in 1989,
yeah,
the tavern owners were concerned about brew pubs because I spent $500,000 for this license, and it's based on population. That's why it's worth so much. It was like a cat medallion.
Just getting out of that right now.
But they would say, what if this guy Dock Street, what if he brews a batch of beer and then sells Budweiser, and all he had to do was pay $50 for a manufacturing license. So the tavern owners, when they passed the brew pub law, they said you can only sell what you brew on premise, and that was what they gave the tavern owners to make it different than the tavern. So somebody would go to the Dock Street. They had come out with a contract beer, bottled beer, brewed up at FX Matt for 5 years before they built their own place. And so people said, give me a bottle of Dock Street. Well, we can't sell that here. That was funny.
That is so backwards.
And then Jeffrey Ware, and that's Tom Pastorius and others. David Mink was the guy with the Sam Adams. They started to say, okay, what about wines produced in Pennsylvania? Can we sell wines that are made in Pennsylvania? And they got that passed. So now basically it's come along. It took a long time, and now we have a micro distilling industry.
Yeah.
So now you can sell spirits that are made in Pennsylvania. So you basically have a full liquor license for the price of a manufacturing license.
Yeah.
As long as it's
made in Pennsylvania.
So, but that's still a concession to the people that have taverns.
Yeah. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Like, liquor licenses, I don't know what's going to happen to them, because I don't know if it'll be just a thing of the past. Like, the government does make a lot of money off of them, but there's all these other ways around kind of having a liquor license, I guess.
I stopped trying to predict what was going to happen.
Just go with the flow. Just go with the flow. So after Prohibition, I guess there were no breweries. Did any breweries pop up immediately after that? Like, did anyone kind of jump right back into it, restart their brewery, start making beer right away?
Yuengling was still, they made it through, right?
Yuengling, but I'm talking about Philadelphia specifically.
Well, in Philly, you had what I said, 1890. Let's say there was 100 breweries. I think by 1900, I think by the time Prohibition started, there was 40.
Yeah.
And then when Prohibition ended, there was 20 that tried to start back up. So you went from 100 down to 20 over a 40 or so year period.
Yeah.
This episode of the Brewdat podcast is brought to you by Zilka & Co., your trusted regional brewing supply partner. Family owned for over 100 years of business, Zilka delivers world-class products at competitive prices with flat $5 delivery fee. No pallet or liftgate charges, thanks to their own fleet of regularly maintained trucks. With locations in Allentown and Hunker and a technical brewer on staff, they provide the expertise and service your brewery deserves. Reach out to Brad Adelson in the show notes and let him know Brewdat sent you.
We've had Chris Kunda on. He owns a beer distributor around here. Did you ever come across the Kunda family name?
Sure.
They're 105, 106 years old at this point.
One of the other kind of trade journals that I looked at was the Adam Scheit Brewery in Norristown. They had a newsletter. house organ.
Yeah.
And they featured the Kundas, like Kunda's probably his grandfather.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah.
I know one of the sons was involved in politics and stuff in King of Prussia, but I think Walt was the guy. I forget if he's the guy that was a pilot in World War II or something. But they had one of these human interest stories about the Kunda family.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they were big movers and shakers for Scheidt,
Okay. So Scheidt was the big brewery?
Norristown.
In Norristown?
Right. Which was plant number 2 for Schmitz.
Oh, they had multiple breweries. I didn't know that.
Schmitz bought the Scheidt Brewery in 1952 or 3.
Okay.
3. And then they bought a brewery in Cleveland. So when you'd look at a label from Schmitz, it said Philadelphia, Norristown, and Cleveland. They had 3 plants.
Wow.
They were poised. They were in the top.
How close were they? Like, how much beer were they making?
They were in the top 12.
Wow.
In the country.
I had no idea.
They were making, in their peak year, they were probably 3.5 million barrels.
Wow. So they were like probably size like Ballantine, something like that, in New York.
Well, at that point, when Billy was,
3.5 million is larger than I think Yuengling is right now, or about the same size.
I think Yuengling's 2.
Yeah.
Well, at one point, Billy Flaumer, who owned Schmitz, he wanted to buy the Fogelsville plant because that was roughly the same size as Schmitz. They could produce 3 million barrels, but they had built it in 1973, so it was complete modern.
Yeah.
But at that time, courts said, that was a conflict of free trade or something, it
was a monopoly.
You're reducing competition, and so he lost that case. But then there was reports that he was going to buy Pabst, and Pabst had like 5 plants, or I don't even know how many plants they were like one of the biggest breweries in the country. And then when that fell through, he goes, "Is Budweiser for sale?" So, and to think that Budweiser now is owned by a
Brazilian finance company that's run out of Belgium or something. And they told Schmidt that he couldn't buy the plants in Pennsylvania because of monopoly.
I just mean, like, if you'd have talked to these brewer guys like 30 years ago, if you would have suggested that anybody in the Bush family would sell their brewery, not much less to a foreign investor.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Your mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But look at, now we got Coors. They were like the Colorado version of the Yuengling family, like family owned. They were vertically integrated. They made their own cans. They made, and then they sell out to a South African Miller Coors Molson. Mm-hmm. And Molson, they even go back further than Yuengling. They have the oldest brewery in North America, not in America. But those 3 now, they're in a South African holding company.
Wow.
So that's what I mean. It's like a violent fermentation, and that's predicting what's going to happen. Anything to do with the brewing industry is a fool's errand.
Yeah. It's just crazy. Like, you look back from your perspective, looking backwards in history, it's like looking at all these interesting things, and then you can't take that to look into the future because, like, you don't know what's going to happen.
I think the biggest thing is the climate.
Okay.
Agricultural product.
Yeah.
And that, like, that's, to me, when in the book they said, well, what's in for the future? Well, yeah. Okay. When I wrote that book in 2000, when it came out in 2012, Iron Hill had just opened in Chestnut Hill. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to predict the future.
That's crazy.
I couldn't have dreamed of this. We thought it was all over, like we had our bubble with, a couple of breweries that tried to start up and didn't. Then Yards makes it through, and then like that's all there is. And then somebody started, we're going to do farmhouse brewing, and then that fell out, and then we're going, well, is that all there is? And here I worked at Manayunk for 3 years. He had the longest running brew pub in the city. they just closed, from flooding and everything. But that started in '90, around the same time. I think a year after Yards.
Wow.
So that was like the, I don't know about now, but that was the longest running brew pub in the city.
I mean, it probably still is. I mean, there's probably, because no one else, probably took like 5-10 years for anyone else to get started.
Right.
That's pretty crazy. So at some point, not at some point, but like craft beer started here. Like, have you looked any into craft beer? Like, craft beer is kind of just so there's so much information that you're more focused on, like, what happened.
I spent some time going through all of the Mid-Atlantic brewing news. At the time, there was something called the Ale Street News. There was another one that was connected with MA Mid-Atlantic that was something down there in Maryland. But anyway, I went through all those magazines and I created a timeline and I chronicled the craft brewing industry in Philadelphia from 1985 to 2005.
Okay.
So I have everything that was written and in the newspaper is on I have a 200-page document.
That's a pretty good timeline, because that's like craft beer does not exist up to the point where craft beer, it's different than it was in 2005, but craft beer is fully established at that point. So that's kind of like the growth to then not stabilization, because that probably happened like 2012, 2013, but it's like that's getting to the point where it's like it's a real thing.
The thing is, like what I was saying earlier, like there's 3 or 4 generations of brewers now in the craft brewing industry. And, when Schmidt's closed, we were thinking, that's it.
Yeah, it's done. It was a good run.
I went to the first craft brewer conference in Portland in 1986.
Wow.
Went to after the sessions and everything, we went to a bar and they had like 20 taps on the bar and they were all made in Portland. And I'm going, I'm never going to see that in Philadelphia. And then later we go to the Bridgeport Brewery and they're making beer. They put a tea bag full of hops in a Hop Stevens keg, and it's fermented in the keg, just like English old style beer. And I'm going, I'll never see that in Philadelphia. And then in 1995, I visited Yards, and they were doing the same thing that I vowed I would never see. And now you can go to how many places in Philadelphia and see 20 taps that are all.
And they stopped doing cask and all these like Hop Stevens, and then now English style beers and like these, cask beers are starting to come back. It's like you've seen it been born, die, and then come back.
But that was another really profound thing was with Camera.
Yeah.
Campaign for real ale in England.
When did that start?
That was like back in the, about the time, that was before I even got my first issue of Zymergy in 1980 or whatever. But they had taken the big brewers to task. Why can't we get real beer? Like you got all these, tied houses and everything. And the brewers actually responded. Like they started to do they did have an impact on the industry. But talk about an impact on the industry. I mean, at that conference in Portland in 1986, the guys from the industry are going, "Oh, microbrewery, I think I have a few here in my pocket. This is never going to go anywhere." It changed the industry.
It did. I mean, I think Anheuser-Busch bought Ballast Point, or whoever bought Ballast Point. They bought it for like $2 billion or $1.5 billion or something. I mean, I think it was worth $200 million 3 years later, but still, they spent $1 billion on it. Like, it was, it changed everything.
In 1994, I went to Siebel. I took the diploma course, 10 weeks in Chicago. Well, anyway, AB had just gotten a piece of Red Hook in Seattle. And so that was big news. And they got like 4% or something. It wasn't even big, but people are calling them a sellout. They bought a piece of Widmer Brothers.
Yeah.
About the same time. And that was the beginning that was the beginning of them, the big guys, saying, okay, we want a piece of this too. You know, like, how can we do? And they started doing it in very innovative ways. And so, like, then AB, it's complicated. They got some kind of a holding company where they were on the board or something, but they owned, you know, a small percentage of it or whatever. And then they built a new brewery for Red Hook out in Seattle. And then more recently, like within the last 10 years, I went to visit the Red Hook Brewery in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And it's the same thing where they have a piece of it, but they're doing it. They figured out like, it's not just like the old days when, you know, Heilemann was buying up all these breweries or brands or whatever, and then it became something, their brand or whatever. This is like, it's in many ways, it's win-win because AB has the biggest distribution, most successful distribution system, and so that's what attracted Red Hook and Widmer Brothers to do that in the first place.
Yeah.
And that's been 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So it's just been very interesting to see all the variations on the theme, you know.
Yeah, everyone's reinventing the wheel, putting their own spin on it.
Nothing new under the sun, but yeah, there is some stuff that's new.
There is. I think, like you're saying, like the micro distilling, that has changed. And now, like, there's stateside has now like the RTDs with Surfside that is like blowing up the industry. And like the brewing response to that is essentially that's great, you know, it's pro alcohol, but it's anti beer because now you're letting distilleries sell their products that used to be exclusively, you know, in beer stores. So the response to that is like, give us some distilling rights then, you know. So there's this bill, the Schmidt bill, which is like allows breweries to distill on the same property, which I think it would totally fuck over distillers because breweries have been leading the industry for so long. They have all the equipment that can handle that. I mean, they would make the distilling industry much better, I think, because they have the equipment to handle the large scale distilling.
Well, it's funny that you're mentioning this because when you go back to the 16s and the 17s,
Yeah.
most breweries had a distillery.
Yeah, and I guess maybe
No way.
Yeah.
when you think those laws changed after Prohibition, maybe they were like they took that as the opportunity, like, all right, let's just do what we were trying to fix before, but this is
I think
started new.
it had weaned, you know, it had gone out of favor, or you know, they stopped doing that like very early on. But the fact was, you could take when beer went bad, went sour, you could distill it, and then it could be used for something else.
Yeah, I mean, you go to a distillery and you're like, this is how you brew your beer? Like, this isn't sanitary. This is like the worst beer brewing system ever. But they make like world-class liquor out of it somehow.
Oh, okay.
They have like open top breweries that are like, they don't even like clean their stuff because it's like, yeah, we'll just distill it and like just goes away. Like, I think if you took the care that it took to like make beer and then you did that with distilling, I think really up to
Do you think that brewers could teach the distillers?
I think they could. I think they could. And I know I'm saying that from a brewer's perspective, but I think they could, you know, clean up if they were allowed to distill. And they're also used to distributing larger volumes, and you know they do temperature control stuff. Like, I think that they have a lot more control over things than distilleries do.
There's somebody that I gotten to know on Facebook, Laura Patrizio, who does to Pennsylvania distilleries. She researches them the way I research beer.
Yeah,
and so we've communicated. You know, we comment on each other's things and so forth, but that's very interesting that they went through very similar things where after Prohibition, like the big guys gobbled up all the, you know, it eliminated the small purveyors or whatever. And
it's also, I mean, it's the distillery's fault that we even had Prohibition. It's like alcohol wasn't really a problem until they made alcohol 40% instead of 5%, and then people got addicted to alcohol because it became like essentially a hard drug version of alcohol. It's like the push. I mean, it was a problem. People were drinking too much, but they were drinking too much because, I mean, liquor was a new thing. It's weird to think about that. Like, liquor didn't exist before, like, the 1800s. Or, I mean, like, it maybe a little bit, but, like, distilling technology is about as new as lager technology. And, you know, all that stuff happened, and then people just kind of, like, I guess didn't know how to handle it. And then we got to a point where, like, we actually had to make alcohol, all the alcohol, illegal. So I blame them, but
We'll have someone come on and dispute you at some point.
I'm sure it will. But I mean, there was big issues. I mean, even in England, they were drinking gin, and they had gin houses where, you know, you paid how much you got drunk was either you got drunk or you got dead drunk, and that's what they called it. And it was just like, you know, how drunk were you getting was how much you paid.
Like going to the opium den.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, it's you know, the distilling is a whole different ball of wax, and I
Have you ever done any of that?
never tried. I met in my colonial brewing. I have come across two women who both had stills, and they're demonstrating this like the same way I do colonial brewing, and they just have a tabletop still. It's not like they're in the backwoods of Kentucky with you know, truck radiators to cool the wort down or anything. You know, they have a tabletop. But the one woman, Mary Webster, explained to me that like midwives and so forth were herbalists. They knew all about the how to make tinctures, and so that's what alcohol did, was a solvent, and so they could make.
They took the alcohol and then pulled all these flavors in.
Well, they could make medicines basically, and also the fact that most farms had stills on them, because it was something you could do. Like making cider was easier than making beer. Making wine is easier than making beer. I mean, the yeast is on the skin of the fruit, you know.
Yeah,
that's itself.
And you don't have to convert the malt sugar into simple sugar.
It's already
simple sugar
there. So, but the thing that they would do, they would take the apple cider and then distill that to make brandy. So that was the hard cider. So that was really popular in colonial times.
Okay.
Because they so many apples. You know, the whole thing about Johnny Appleseed, I think he was planting all those apple trees to make brandy. Didn't have anything to do with an apple a day keeps the doctor away, you know.
Yeah, you just forget to go to the doctor. That's funny. So I guess you said this book came out when, in 2012?
Yes.
When it came out, I mean, what was it like? I mean, what was, I guess, writing a book like? I mean, you were doing all this research, I guess, even before you decided you were going to write a book, and then you just had to, I guess, concentrate all that, you know, information into this book. Like, how did, like, organizing it and writing it, like, determining, like, kind of the layout was going to go?
And what year did you also know, too? Like, okay, now you had an idea, but, like, when you're like, I'm going to start writing it now.
Well, I mean, like, I started out giving tours of old breweries. So we did one in Philadelphia in 1987. Ironically, like the same month that Schmidt's closed. And so it was
pretty short tour.
It was locked. Yeah, we were hoping we could have gotten a tour, but, you know, they were all closed and everything. And then we gave, I think the first tour we did was actually a year or two earlier in Pittsburgh. But for each city, I've done tours in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, the Lehigh Valley, what I call South Central Pennsylvania, and the Luzerne and Lackawanna County. So I created guidebooks to go with each of those tours, just self-published guidebooks that would list the stops on the tour, other information and stuff. So that was kind of like
the precursor.
That was where I honed some of that. But to try to do it for a publisher definitely was taking it up a few notches.
Yeah.
And then also to try to, you ask about the layout. I with a city that goes back to the 1680s, and we're doing 21st century.
Yeah.
How do I? And so that's become my niche. Is like, it's 350 years and 160 pages.
Yeah.
How do I find myself in a lot of the writing I'm doing now for the Brewery and Collector magazines. I'm distilling. Talking about distilling. I'm taking this, 80 pages of articles from the newspapers.com and Western Brewer and this and that. How do I turn this into a 6-page article? Mm-hmm. And that's where I'm at, it seems.
Yeah.
And so it's boiling it down. But anyway, to get to the book, start with the beginning, and then I did it by neighborhoods.
Okay.
And then I did it by after Prohibition, and then I did it craft.
Okay.
And that's how I figured out the layout.
And that makes it made a lot of sense. I was reading it, so like that gave me a good overview. It wasn't like I was just like confused and having to go back. Like I understood kind of where your thought process was at through the whole thing.
And for the Brewery and collectors, it's the post-Prohibition era that has most of the people that collect beer cans, people that collect. I mean, there's a lot of stuff from the 1800s and early 1900s, the beautiful lithographs and everything. But like people, you ask, it's getting harder to find, but most people in Philadelphia knew about the Gretz Brewery, and they knew about the Esslinger Brewery, and they'd heard of the Ortlieb Brewery, and they knew Schmidt's. But it's getting further and further away from that time. So people don't even know.
I've said this in a previous podcast. It was cool to read because I was already in brewing for a number of years when I read it, and to see, it's not that somebody would write a book about it, but like the story of the Philadelphia beer is obviously told in parallel to the story of Philadelphia, but it was like I was seeing things that were happening in the city were affecting beer, or beer was affecting other parts of history. And it was cool to see that, what I'm doing now is more than just like me trying to come up with a stupid name for a new IPA. It's like trying to do what I'm doing is like it's adding to the culture of Philadelphia.
Continuing a long-standing tradition.
Yes, and I'm not the person that invented this. It's been going on since 1680. But taking that, and for the last 400 years, people have been doing this, and it's been adding to the life of people in Philadelphia.
And being proud of making the best possible article of beer you can.
Yes.
That's the pride of the brewer.
Yeah. It was very cool reading that. It was, I do like history, but it was like cool reading that, like about, a city that we're, in, and then I'm kind of in this industry. It was very interesting. But I guess so you wrote the book, and then what? You just sell it on Amazon, or like how do you go about publishing it and like putting it out?
The History Press had you work with them, and they helped to advertise it, and I got it into some bookstores and so forth. But basically, I haven't. I left Manioc in 2003, so I devoted my time, in addition to the research and writing, I do my slideshows. Yeah. And so that gives me a chance to sell. It's like, give the slideshow. And then I also have created posters. So I have a poster you may have seen in some of the bars. It's Philadelphia Breweries 1896. And it's got a map in the middle. And then the breweries are numbered, and you can find them on the map.
I have seen that, yeah.
It tells you the address and the production of each one. Yeah. And that was kind of like the heyday. That was after the 93 or however many there were in 1880, but like that. And then I also made a poster. The first poster I made was from 1980 to 87, having visited close to 300 or 400 brewing sites. I made a collage of all the dilapidated brewery buildings in the state. Mm-hmm. So that was my first poster, and then I did this 1896 poster. And then after the book came out, I actually upgraded that to digital, but then a couple of years later, I did one called the Philadelphia Brewery Directory that has all these ads from every brewery I had an ad from like the 1880s to like 1910 or so. And so it's got, I forget how many there are, but it's like looking at one of those pages in the a phone book or something that has the ads for all the, but it's a composite.
Yeah. Yeah, and like what you're saying, like the pictures of the breweries, it's like the history of the architecture around Philadelphia also. It's like people are go to the Schmidt Commons every day. They like the Potts Brewery, Whitesboro has. It's like all these places that people see every day, but it doesn't even cross their mind to like, oh, this was a brewery for 100 years. It was like, it's like kind of what shaped the city and how it's laid out. And it's just become commonplace. Like that's just the name of these things. They don't realize that it's like there's like Orleans. Like they just think that that's the bar with a big O in front of it. It's like the people living in Northern Liberties don't realize the history.
We have some of the best brewery preservations in the city. The Bergdahl Brewery condominiums at 29th and Parish is just phenomenal. The old Class and the Cod Brewery at 10th and Montgomery, which is now housing for Temple. The one you just mentioned, I haven't been there since they've been working on it. I was there before they started working on it, but the Poth Brewery was like the last big brewery that was left in Brewery Town. Yeah. And I always hoped that something would happen with that.
Well, Stone's beer distributor was there for about 2 years. I've looked at the property to move there. It just, there's not enough traffic over there. It doesn't make sense to open up a brewery there right now. But
the Gretz Brewery, if you've ever seen, that's a prominent landmark on Germantown Avenue. It's the Gretz smokestack. So that's been one that's just been falling apart brick by brick for years and years.
The whole Germantown, like the architecture there, it just looks like, I mean, that's where you like reading the book. Like that's where all the breweries were located there, Brewery Town. But especially in Germantown, like the Germantown Historical Society has done a great job, like preserving the old buildings there. And you're seeing the architecture of like these buildings that still exist that used to have, and they have like the names of the breweries on them. It's cool.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, but we've got a number of these. That's another one of my interests is brewery preservation. Best case scenario is it reincarnates it as a brewery. Mm-hmm. But if you take, say, the Ortley bottling shop, and then that becomes an architectural firm's offices, that's almost as good.
I mean, they like it, but it's even consolidating that, like within the craft beer world, like Dock Street turns into Carbon Copy.
Yep.
What was it before Human Road?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Because
Separatist was over there.
Separatist. It's like there's even a lot of breweries in Philadelphia. Like, Yards has now turned into Mainstay. It's like, even like on a small timeline, a lot of these places are just recycled.
For me, when I started photographing this, I was most interested in these grand architectural things, because the brewhouse, if you've ever seen the Stegmeyer Brewery in Wilkes-Barre, it's just a magnificent building. Yeah. But now, like, well, this is the Yards Brewery from Umbria Street. Well, it's a warehouse, it doesn't have the same interest to me. Yeah. And yet, like what you're saying, we've got breweries that are like third different company in the same thing. It may not be an old brewery building, but there's history in the stuff's building. Still there. We don't have to move anything, so we'll buy it, take it as is.
Well, I think that's just you can see kind of in parallel of like the history of breweries is like the history of the architecture in the city. People aren't building beautiful buildings that look like these old breweries now. Right. Even the new Sierra Nevada breweries, they just look like a giant Amazon warehouse from the outside. It's like they don't look like a big. They don't look like the Poth Brewery or the Whitesboro and Hess building. Like they don't look like that anymore.
No. But now we get into the architecture thing. We've got Otto C. Wolff, who was the premier Philadelphia brewery architect, and he built breweries from Norway to Cuba to California to Philadelphia to New York.
Wow.
He had like 400 projects to his credit when he died.
And what year was that? Like what?
1917.
Okay.
So, and what's
Did
interesting,
planes exist back then? Like, how was he going? Like, he was traveling by boat to like all around the world.
I don't know how he did it.
Like word of mouth. I think you need this guy.
But the first lager beer brewery in America,
Yeah.
according to the lithograph, was the Angle and Wolf Brewery at Fountain Green in Fairmount Park, and so it was Angle and Wolf. Well, Charles Wolfe was Otto C. Wolfe's father, and Otto C. Wolfe was responsible for building these massive modern things, big refrigerated spaces.
Yeah.
And the Angle and Wolf Brewery had 50,000 cubic feet of caves dug into the side of the Schuylkill banks of the Schuylkill River. There was 5 different cells. Their cells about 20 by 40 feet. They had 5 of them in a series. And when I read a story about Otto C. Wolfe and how many of his buildings are still standing, but I just imagined him as a youth going down to see his dad's brewery and walking into these caves, dug man-made spaces to refrigerate. Mm-hmm. And then he's in the first class of mechanical engineering at Penn, graduates in 1876, goes to work for his uncle in Chicago, who has a license to build these patented refrigerating machines, and really learns
he takes like the inspiration that what he saw, and like, you know, his journey wasn't to brew the beer, but it was to build these crazy breweries. He was on the board of Bergner and Engel. He was he designed the Weldon Thomas Brewery in South Philly and was on the board of that. He was on the board of the Brewers Bank on Ridge Avenue. He was all over the map. Oh, he was president of the Philadelphia Yeast Manufacturing Company. So we've got so many heavy hitters, if you will. Yeah.
Like the guy from Schmidt's, Edward Schmidt. He was president of the United States Brewers Association.
Wow.
And Otto C. Wolfe was the treasurer, one of the other officers. We were forced to be reckoned with, definitely.
And we were talking briefly before, like now Schmidt has become Von C. Or like
that has been nice to see.
Yeah.
Because it's the one brewery, the last brewery that was still in the city, but that I got to know a little bit behind the scenes about, and then to see the same thing.
You're talking to people that are working there, and
people that are working there, and
bridging the gap to now what is
and they're very proud of that heritage and stuff, and so plus it's Norristown, which is where they had the Scheidt Brewery.
Oh, I didn't even put this together.
Not even that far removed.
Yeah,
which is cool.
That is very funny. Wow. So where do you think beer is headed next?
That's in my head. I'm like, I needed to ask that question.
Where is it headed?
Yeah, like you've seen
so much.
I was watching one of your podcasts.
Yeah,
and I think it was Ruby Rubenstein.
Yeah,
who says, "I just want to make some classic beer styles."
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
mm-hmm. I think. Personally, look, I've had enough with we made beer out of rabbit hair and we made beer, whatever the heck else they're making. That's all well and good and it's fun. And God bless Sam Clagione.
Yeah.
He's famous for saying that the Reinheitsgebot did more to stifle creativity in the brewing industry than any other law. But there was a guy that wanted to start one that said, I want to make some classic beer styles. Let's see if we can do it to dial it in and do it the way it's,
It's been done.
I don't know. Who would have thought the Malternatives when they came around, like making Kool-Aid and moonshine or whatever.
Yeah.
Like that was the Fogelsville, Guinness, whatever the holding company for them, they were making that Smirnoff stuff.
Really?
Oh,
That really
Didn't realize the same
for
company.
years, yeah. But that you never know what's around the next bend.
Yeah.
know?
But classic beer styles have stayed through that. All these trends come and go, but the one consistent thing is that classic beer styles will always kind of be the base of it.
And I asked somebody, I said, like, how come, it just didn't work like 30 years ago? And he goes, you didn't have the educated public.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Tom Peters from Monks.
Yeah.
He used to invite the beer writers, and I used to write for some of the magazines. So I would be there, and I'd sit there thinking to myself, here we are at a table with 6 people that write about Philadelphia beer.
Yeah.
And when I went to Portland in 1986, Fred Eckert and Michael Jackson were probably the only 2 beer writers in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now we got 6 sitting at the same table that are all writing just about Philadelphia.
And it was it. You, Joe Sixpack, Lou Bryson.
And all that. But, the fact that everybody got on board with it and it got excited about it, wants to learn about it, like that created a whole ecosystem of its own.
Yeah.
So that's part of it is people. So, but who knows what the next.
But I think stuff like this book is why people love craft beer, because like you're saying, there's the education of it, and part of beer is the culture of it. They want to feel connected to, like, maybe subconsciously, like they're not their ancestors, but it's like they feel like it's like it is a part of who they are as a person, and getting people. A lot of people are not willing to drive down to Washington, D.C. to look at the primary source information, but they don't have to because you put it all in this like very easy to digest book.
Well, people. I know the guy that made this beer.
Yeah.
I know him. He talked to me. Like if you're drinking one of these, it's coming out of some factory somewhere 1,000 miles away, but that's a real aspect that used to be, like guys are getting fistfights in Brewery Town about who had the better brewmaster, Burner Engel or Post or Barnholt and Schaefer,
Yeah. Which that's one of the reasons I really like Yuengling, but like it's still like truly a family-run company. It's very cool that they're thriving.
I'm happy to see that they survived the beer wars.
Yeah.
And that they have become such a player. I mean,
they're nationwide.
I mean, in 1976, they were having trouble making their payroll.
Yeah.
And look at them now. Brewery in Tampa, 2 breweries in Pottsville.
Yeah, they have one in Texas now, right?
Available?
I didn't hear that.
Maybe I just made that up.
They're even.
No, I think you're right, actually. I think you're right.
They're even, last I was reading, they were going into negotiations to have this Miller Coors Molson produce their beer for them to expand their markets.
Really?
Wow.
So that's another thing,
Taking over. Wawa and like taking over the world.
Go Philly.
You never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Never say never. That's part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess looking back at the history of it, like you're kind of able to see like, people if you don't look at history, like you see like all the trends in craft beer, like this is going to change everything. Like, but if you take like a long-term vision of everything, you take a step back, like you're able to kind of see through the ups and downs and like kind of cut through a lot of the BS.
It's a tough business.
Yeah. But it's fun. It's rewarding. So you had Lou Bryson write the forward.
He did the forward.
Are you a friend of his, or you guys have just kind of crossed paths?
We know each other.
Okay. I guess this book is mostly sold just in stores online.
I have it on my website. But,
Okay.
I think it's on.
I bought it at Philadelphia Brewing, actually.
Oh,
really?
Yeah,
Oh, that's cool.
but yeah, it's great. And you said
and I also have a guidebook, which is totally different than this. The guidebook is all the breweries that could have been on one of my Philadelphia brewery tours. So that's a self-published book. It's a spiral-bound thing. It's not a glitzy of a package.
Yeah.
But it chronicles my first Philadelphia brewery tour in 1987 to the, I don't know when the last one was, but I've done 25 of them in the meantime. So one of the most interesting ones, and I was running around this neighborhood and others in 1985, 86, looking at every address that was in this book and to see if there was anything standing there. And and I thought I had covered them. I got so many notes and pages and stuff. And the woman that you said put me in touch with you, Meredith.
Yes.
She did a lager beer walk and got me involved with that. But it started at this Weiss Beer Brewery in Philadelphia, and it was one that isn't in my guidebook.
No way.
It's one I didn't know was still standing, and now it's an event center. Like somebody actually, and this was right under not under my nose, but it's down there off of Girard Avenue, and I'm going, this is embarrassing. I'm Mr. Philly beer, and I did, But the Weiss beer breweries were a phenomenon because they were quick and dirty. It was beer, it was yeast and lactobacillus in the fermentation, and so it was kind of like making steam beer, where they ferment it and then age it for practically no time, and then put it in bottles or the kegs, and then let it finish in there. And, so, and I've had, I don't know if you ever had Berliner Weiss beer.
Yeah.
It's an acquired taste and not acquired by all that many.
Yeah.
But, cause it's sour. But this was big popular. It was like the poor man's wine.
Well,
poor man's champagne,
Nottinghead at one point, in the prime of Nottinghead, was the largest producer of Berliner Weiss in the world outside of Berlin.
Yes. Wow. They brought it back.
Yeah.
And now it's a big category at the GABF. Everybody's got to make one.
Yeah, I mean, people like the little tart, low ABV sours. I mean, they're popular now. I mean, with college kids, but it's like people drink them.
But, I mean, there was literally 20 or 30 Weiss beer breweries in Philly. In fact, Trooper Ortlieb was in the Civil War, and when he got out of the Civil War, he got a little Weiss beer brewery. The pictures I've seen of the few that I've seen pictures of,
they have pictures of them.
A couple of them, it looks like they're in a garage. It's not like one of these magnificent Otto C. Wolf, Bergdahl brewery things. It's like it's in a garage. So they were brewing in Berlin. The recipe called for a certain percentage of wheat. In America, they would probably just use corn. So, because it was cheaper.
Yeah.
But it was the same idea. But there was a whole bunch of Weiss beer breweries in Philly.
Well, I guess what would they call it? It was not Weiss. How do you say corn in German? Do they even know corn existed in Germany?
I don't know what the
corn is American, right?
I don't know what the German word for corn is. Well, they probably would put some wheat in there, but
Okay, yeah.
They could supplement. Somebody asked me that. I was working with this group, and they asked me about the American brewers using corn, because everybody likes to say, "Oh, they just cheapened the product," and the whole Reinheitsgebot thing. But in brewing school, what I learned was that the varieties of malt in America, North America, had a higher diastatic enzyme content.
Yeah.
So basically, by adding corn, you were making the best use of your materials. It wasn't to cheapen the product as much as it was to get the last dime out of every nickel, as I like to say.
Yeah.
But, so that was really, I mean, it wasn't just...
It was truly an American thing. Like I said, corn is not in Europe. So it's it's cheaper, but it's also kind of our national, spin on beer.
Well, and corn squeezins, when they opened up the Mississippi River Valley, they had so much corn, they had to make whiskey out of it, Yeah. Because it would go bad.
Nice. Yeah, I've learned a lot today. So like, what are you doing now? It's like people can like find you
On my website.
On your website?
I'm on Facebook.
Okay. And on your website, what, you have articles on there that you post about like different things that you're
All the
finding?
articles I've written are in the archives link of my website.
Cool.
You still writing and like researching all the time?
Well, I'm the people I was just talking about were the people in Bethlehem at the National Museum of Industrial History in the old Bethlehem steel plant, and they're going to do an exhibit. They want to do an exhibit about the Centennial Exhibition and beer. And so I've been working with them on that, and they had just taken a tour of Yuengling, and so they asked me that question about the corn, and they said, "Well, that's interesting because nobody could answer that question over Yuengling." I took that as a pat on the back.
Yeah. So we can find and what's your website?
PABreweryhistorians.tripod.com.
Okay.
It's a free tripod website.
Okay.
I've had it for years and years. But yeah, and you can find me. You can email me if you have questions or,
and I'll put everything on the notes as well.
The other thing I'm working on is one of these Breweriana clubs is having their convention in Philadelphia in 2026. So I'm doing they have a quarterly news magazine. I'm doing 4 different stories on Philadelphia.
Wait for the CBC next year?
For the National Association of Brewery Advertising.
Is that during CBC or is that at another time?
No, it's in the summertime.
Okay.
Oh, that's interesting.
But yeah, so I'm
It's going on 2026.
I'm working on the second one right now. I read the first one. It was about the early Philly. Second one's about the early lager. Then I'm going to do one on things that are there and things that aren't there anymore. And I don't know what I'll do for the fourth one. But I'm going back to this, talking to this brewmaster, Bill Muller, telling me he did a 4-part thing leading up to a convention. And I felt like,
Now's your turn.
I took the baton.
Yeah.
Running with it,
Took the beer bottle. Cool. Well, thank you for coming on. Ever since I read the book, I wanted to meet you. So having the podcast is a good excuse to meet you guys.
I always like getting this feedback too, because you throw it out there, and unless somebody says, "Hey,
people are reading it." Like I bring up the book sometimes on the podcast, and especially the brewers, they really get a kick out of it because, like I said, it's like. I think they see themselves in the history of it, and they kind of see like, oh wow, this is beyond just like me involved in this craft beer scene. This is larger.
It does.
Than
it gives you a little depth.
Yeah, and it's beyond just beer. It's culture. So I think people really yes, exactly.
I'm doing it now.
Yeah, taking the baton and running. I think people like that. But thank you again for coming on.
Thank you.
And you can find us at Brewdat at the Brewdat Podcast. Subscribe on YouTube, and we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Yeah, real quick. I also just want to shout out here, everybody, like, comment, and engage so we can continue to get like amazing guests such as Rich, such as Tom Peters from Monks. Like, just keep hitting up us on social media and push that out because we're only going to get better from here, and it's pretty crazy. So also thanks to everybody right now. It's been kind of a wild ride, right?
It's fun. Keep it going.
Yeah. Heck yeah.
Cool. Thank you.